let's get started here. Now, a lot of the anatomy stuff, I'm gonna go through, like areas where we're gonna have different kind of reactions, right? Different kind of digestion, what gets digested, what gets produced to help digestion. Always keep in mind, in the back of your mind, you wanna think about, when we're thinking about a lot of these physiology kind of questions is, number one, why is it happening? And how does the body efficiently cause this to happen? So in terms of digestion, we want to eat as much as we can and then be able to break down all those nutrients and then absorb it and then incorporate it. So when we have, and our body's, pretty much good with binge eating. So if you binge eat, usually that's what happens as we evolved. So you never had, think about you are living during Roman rule, might not have food every day. So you might, when you do have food, you want to be able to eat as much as you can, break it down, absorb as much of it as you can, so then you have enough fat available, enough glycogen available, that when you are fasting and you're forced to not eat because you don't have food available for that next few days, that you have enough fat so that you can use it and survive those fasting, almost starving points. So everything that our body does, from adjusting to eating really, rich foods, adjusting when you eat, let's say like an ice cream sundae. At first it tastes really sweet, right? And then your brain starts to adjust, so then that next bite, what happens? It doesn't taste as sweet. Then the next couple bites, it doesn't taste sweet at all. So by the time you're done, you're kind of licking the spoon, trying to get some more. That's what our body likes to do. There's also that tendency to overeat as a result. Now, we do that to things that we really, really require: carbohydrates, proteins, salts. So when you eat a bag of potato chips, so you first bite up that potato chip, it's going to be very salty, but you need that sodium chloride. And early on, we're talking about, it wasn't until probably 100 years ago that we have so much salt in our diet. Well, before then, huge dynasties will go up and down based on the trading of salt. That's how important it was. So what happens? When you have salt available, you want to ingest as much as humanly possible. So when you eat it, the first bite, it tastes really salty, and then you adjust to it, accommodate to that taste. By the time you're done, you don't even taste the salt. You're licking your fingers, trying to get every bit of salt left, because you don't really taste it at all. So just keep that in the back of your mind when we start talking about digestion, that our body does have a tendency to want to overeat. So then you can store more nutrients, store more even salt. Even when you think about urination, right? Urination also allows us to not just keep water as much as possible, but also reabsorb a lot of salt. So everything that our body does is to retain as much fluids, nutrients as possible. So when we eat, it kind of makes sense why we want to break everything down as efficiently, and then absorb it, introduce it in the bloodstream, and then store it as fat. Now, we kind of talked about what kind of gets absorbed where. So in terms of GI tract, we think about our stomach being incredibly important. Our stomach is important, but it's not quite as important as our small intestine. Now, we can actually bypass the stomach. So that kind of tells you about its importance, right? If we can bypass it and people still survive, it's not like it's not necessary, but it is just like an additive agent. Now, what do we mean by bypassing it? If you watch some of those videos on 600 Pound Life, they very seldomly they get a chance to do what's called the bypass, where they will take the esophagus, and instead of the esophagus leading into the stomach, they'll take the esophagus, remove it from the stomach, and then connect it to the distal part of your ileo and your jejunum region. So you're basically bypassing the whole stomach with that, kind of surgery that we see. So what we see in the stomach is this, right? These are the three main cells in the stomach that we need to know. And the only thing we absorb in the stomach, though, is water, a little bit of aspirin, and alcohol. That's it. Notice we don't have any nutrient absorption. We don't have any carbohydrates, proteins, or fat absorbed here. Small intestines is where we have all of the absorption of our nutrients. Now, in terms of the digestive system, we have two types of movement. Propulsion movement, which is peristalsis. Most of you guys have heard of this before. Peristalsis is when you have that movement of that bolus of chyme from one region to another. Kind of like you're squeezing that food from one space to another to another. As you're squeezing it, what's causing the squeezing is this. The muscles over here, the muscle in back of this bolus of chyme contracts. As this muscle contracts behind this bolus of chyme right here, it squeezes that morsel of food forward. The area in front of that bolus of food relaxes. So you have a bolus of food coming in. How do we move it from one spot to the next to the next? Well, the area in front of the bolus relaxes. The area behind the bolus contracts and squeezes. As it squeezes, now you have a relaxed muscle in front. So now that bolus can be moved to the next segment. It's kind of cool, right? And basically what we see in peristalsis is just kind of squeezing that food material from one spot to the next continuously. So the main job of peristalsis is just food movement. This one, segmental contraction, is different. It's food mixing. Now, food mixing is very important because remember, keep in mind, you have that chyme. Think of a thick slurry or soup. And now when you're forcing it from one region to another, you're squeezing it from one part of the GI tract to the next. Well, you have enzymes coming in. Lots of what we call pancreatic juices. What would happen if we just kind of don't mix anything? So then the bolus of food is kind of like this thick soup, and then you have all the enzymes surrounding it. Well, what happens is all the enzymes, all the juices, it will start to, catalyze the reaction of the food material that is superficial. But the deeper bolus areas, right here, how do we get enzymes deep inside? Right here then. We can't. Right? So what we do is when we release the actual pancreatic juices, we mix. This is what this segmental contraction is. It's like taking some Gatorade, putting it into some water, and then mixing it up. Right? That's just the segmental contraction. By mixing it up, you allow the bolus of food to disperse. You allow all the enzymes to go all the way into your bolus. And then you're able to work, enzymatically work on the food matter that is very deep. So segmental contractions allow you to mix the juices with the bolus of chyme or food matter. Now, in the GI tract, we'll notice that you have a mucosa, submucosa, and then you're going to have a muscularis layer. 3 main layers. And they should sound very similar to what we saw in the artery, where you saw tunicum, right? Intima, media, and externa. Now, the mucosa is one that makes it look kind of glossy. Everybody's mucosa should look glossy and pink. When there's a problem, there's either a loss of that shine or it starts becoming red. Really, really red. The mucosa, depending on where we are, in the mouth, in the esophagus, we have stratified squamous cells. Right? So at the very start of the GI tract, you have stratified squamous cells forming the mucosa, and then at the very end of the GI tract, anal canal, you'll have stratified squamous. That's there for protection. So you're eating food, you're chewing. The food itself might have bones in there. So what you need to do is protect the lining of your mouth. And then once you swallow, that bone can actually go down the esophagus, where it's very narrow. Well, what happens? You need protection. Stratified squamous cells are there to protect. Now keep in mind, it's always hard to imagine that you have these stratified squamous cells. How do they relate to the mucous membrane? So you have stratified squamous cells, and then on top of the stratified squamous, and between them, you'll have mucus. Lots of mucus between them. And other important thing is that in the mucosa itself, you have a muscle layer. The muscle layer is not as pronounced here in the esophagus as it will be in the stomach, as it will be in the small intestine. So there's a smaller layer of muscle found in the mucosa called the muscularis mucosa. This layer does not allow food to be moved in any one direction. That's a different layer. This layer is just found underneath the rugae, allowing you to relax and allow for more filling. The submucosa is what we see in white right here. And the important thing about the submucosa is this is where we see a lot of your glands. So the glands that allows you to lubricate your esophagus, well, those glands are found in a deeper layer of the submucosa. And the submucosa are going to contain glands that releases those secretions, and it's going to have neurons attached to it. Those neurons are called the submucosal plexus. So submucosal plexus are sometimes called the Meissner's plexus. Those plexus are all coming from your vagus nerve, your main parasympathetic cranial nerve. And the main job there is to increase secretion of the submucosal glands. Now, big picture. You're eating, you're digesting. Is that sympathetic or parasympathetic? It's parasympathetic, rest and digest, right? So you're eating and digesting at this point. What we want to do is activate your GI tract. What is the only nerve that goes to the GI tract like that? It's your vagus. So once the vagus nerve activates, it's going to cause increased secretions. So that makes it easier for you to even move your food through the esophagus. In the stomach, the vagus nerve is going to allow for more gastric contractions. It's going to allow for more secretions there that we'll talk about coming up. So now we're eating, we want to upregulate everything. And it's all caused by branches of the vagus nerve. This last layer, the muscularis externa, this layer, there's two layers throughout your GI tract. There's a third layer in the stomach. There's an inner circular layer. The main job of that layer is it's circular. So when it contracts, it kind of, constricts. As it constricts, what do when you constrict? You're pushing something forward. That allows you to propel food forward. The outer layer is more longitudinal, like a line. When it constricts, it shortens. So then when it shortens, there's less room for that food to have to go through. Again, we want to maximize the contact time when we have food going into the GI tract. At the same time, we want to make sure that it's easy to move in and out. This layer also contains plexus called the myenteric plexus. Anytime you hear mya means muscle, enteric means the mesentery or the GI tract. So myenteric plexus means these are for the muscles of the GI tract. The last layer is a connective tissue layer. It's serosa in the abdominal cavity. In the thoracic cavity, it's called the adventitia. So they're very similar. The difference is just location. So in the esophagus, as it comes down, there's this connective tissue that kind of covers it, links it to the larynx in front, links it on the way down with the descending aorta. Right. In terms of regulation, we kind of discussed that there is this local control, right? So when people have, that this does happen, even if it's in a medically induced coma, and we know that we're gonna get you out of it in a couple of days. Well, there's certain type of meningitis, there's certain type of encephalitis, and people with seizure disorders, we might wanna put them in a medically induced coma. People with subdural bleeding, right? Or even, an epidural bleeding in the brain. We might want them to be in a drug-induced coma, so then the brain activity decreases. So then there's a greater chance that you can kind of save and preserve the brain. So what happens is people in that state, well, we still need to feed them, still need to eat. So if you've ever seen a kid and they have a little tube going into their nose, that's a feeding tube. The feeding tube does not go into the mouth, it goes into the nose. As it goes into the nose, we can bring nutrients by way of that tube into the stomach. When that happens, we cause a local control right here. And when we see this local control, as soon as you bring that food into the stomach stretches. As the stomach stretches, it goes and activates right here. So you see a stretch, you see a pH change. It causes these reflexes to occur as the sensation of stretch is carried by the sensory part of your vagus nerve, and then it goes into the myenteric plexus. What happens then? That stretch causes the muscle of the stomach to want to contract. Perfect. Now you're starting to contract the stomach muscle. At the same time, the change in pH, because we put food in there, but without food, the pH of the stomach is very low, pH about 1.5, right? Once you put food in there, well, that food matter that you put in there sops up all that hydrochloric acid. So the pH actually increases when you have food ingestion or introduction. That pH change is felt, and now we send that signal to the submucosal plexus. The pH change causes motor neurons to activate, so then you can secrete enzymes in the stomach. So you can secrete more hydrochloric acid. The stretch is sent to the myenteric plexus. The myenteric plexus then activate the smooth muscle of the stomach so that you can mix and churn everything. All of this is happening all because of introduction of food. That's all it is. And because you're able to kind of mobilize and your cardiovascular system is still intact, you're able to digest, absorb, and then bring it to the liver. Now, when people are brain dead, that's completely different than in an unresponsive or comatose state. When people are brain dead, that means there's no more blood flow going into the brain. Do you guys talk about that in 201? Brain death is basically what happens, and we measure it one or two ways. One way is by blood flow to the brain. Obviously, if there's no blood flow to the brain, we know the brain is not going to survive. The brain has died. All right. The second way we can see brain death is by measuring the EEG output. So even in sleep or in a vegetative state, you can have EEG output. So we put electrodes here, we can measure it. When people have a lack of an EEG spike, and we check it once and there's nothing, and then we check it 24 hours later and there's still nothing, right? We can say that they're physically brain dead, right? That's different than in a vegetative state. Vegetative state, there's always EEG output. What happens then? Well, in a vegetative state, cardiovascular system is still intact. We do tube feeding, we can keep them alive almost indefinitely, almost to the detriment of the family, right? Well, you're brain dead, that's different, right? Your cardiovascular system and your body is going to start to decompose. Introduction of food is not going to keep you alive, no matter what. Here, in a vegetative state, introduction of food causes stretch and a pH change, which causes a reflex reaction to produce more enzymes and hormones to cause activation of the muscles so that you can mix and churn and you can move that food particle to a different location. Now, in reality, right, most of us are here, we're not brain dead, we're not in a vegetative state, so we have our vagus nerve being active, and our vagus nerve allows us to kind of activate the stomach without even having food introduced into your mouth. How many times have you guys been really hungry and just the thought of food makes your mouth kind of water? The smell of it, right? Or watching somebody eat. Hopefully nobody slobbers when somebody's eating in class, but that does happen from time to time, right? When you're really hungry and next thing you know, you want to eat, but you have to wait and you start thinking of food. And that's enough for your stomach to grumble a little bit louder as the vagus nerve starts to get ready. So then when you do eat, everything is already present at high enough quantities. So then you can dissolve you can break down, and then you can absorb. So when we talk about the vagus nerve being functional, it's functional, it's very important when we're active, when we're kind of, alive here, so then we can stimulate before food goes into your mouth. The peritoneum is very similar to the pleura. We see a visceral and a parietal. It's very similar in a lot of ways. Remember, the parietal pleura lines the inner part of your ribs. The parietal peritoneum lines the inside of your abdominal cavity. The visceral peritoneum, though, is different. In the lungs, the visceral pleura of the lungs just covers the lungs. There's really nothing else. Well, in the abdomen, you have lots of different organs. You get the liver, you get the pancreas, you get the small intestines, lots, like 20 feet of small intestines. You get the large intestines, you get the gallbladder, you get the spleen. Well, all of those, the spleen has part of our visceral peritoneum. So they cover the organs that are found in the abdominal cavity. The stomach will have visceral peritoneum covering the outside. The large intestines will have visceral peritoneum covering the outside. Now, you will hear large intestines and colon. Those two are used interchangeably. Keep that in mind. Large intestine and colon, they're used interchangeably. So the peritoneum is very similar to the pleural system. The parietal pleura lines the inside of your rib cage. The parietal peritoneum lines the inside of our abdominal cavity, all the way towards the back even. The visceral pleura is found covering the lungs. The visceral peritoneum covers all the organs that are found in the abdomen. And covering the whole GI tract is this kind of fat tissue we call the greater omentum, right here. And the greater omentum, if you've ever seen videos of people having abdominal surgery, you see lots of fat. This is the intra-abdominal fat that we see. And it's there to kind of shield and protect. So in terms of the oral cavity, a lot of this, you can read, it's a lot of anatomy, so I'll have you guys just read it by yourselves. The teeth, I wouldn't ask many questions on the teeth on the test. In the lab practical, that's where we would ask it. And this one kind of shows us the difference between the cementum and the dentin and enamel. Mastication, kind of talked about it previously, that's chewing. Main job of that chewing is to break it down into small enough bits so then when you swallow, it feels comfortable to swallow, right? You decide when to swallow. Have you guys ever heard of Ponderosa? Yeah. Right? I remember when I was young and we would just be happy to go to Ponderosa and have all the steaks there. But sometimes when you get steaks well done and really well done, you're chewing for like an hour, trying to get it bitten down to the point where you feel comfortable swallowing, right? So what happens is you chew and chew, you're breaking apart the food matter. You are not kind of breaking apart any of the bonds, right? What you do is physically break apart all the pieces of protein or meat. So as we chew, we masticate, and then we decide when to swallow. As we swallow right here, right? Swallowing is a reflex, but we can control the very start of it. Now, these salivary glands right here, the parotid, the sublingual, and submandibular. Some of them will be serous in that it's a little bit more watery. It's also, when things are more watery, it's going to be more enzyme rich. Remember, keep in mind, our body wants to be efficient. So if we are not eating, do we want to waste energy and produce this enzyme-rich, watery kind of secretion? No, right? When we're not eating, other types of salivary glands, mainly the sublingual glands, activate. The sublingual glands produce slightly more mucus. So you might have a friend, I always had a friend that played football, and when we played football, there's always that one or two people, or any sport, that has to spit when they work out. It's kind of gross, right? The reason why it's simple is that when you're working out, you're producing a mucus that's a little bit thicker, all right? You're producing this more mucousy type of mucus, and the main job of that is just coat the mouth. At the same time, it's thick, so it's not very comfortable to have all that thick mucus in there. That's why they sometimes feel the urge to kind of spit a lot. Now, the serous secretion found in the parotid and the submandibular, serous fluid, and it's usually more enzyme rich. We activate these when we are eating food. We activate it in greater amounts when the vagus nerve causes these to activate as well. So depending on if we're eating, if we're not eating, right, we'll have secretions that are thicker. When you have sympathetic output, you're working out, you're not eating, what happens? More mucousy secretion. When you are eating, you'll have the vagus nerve, and you'll have more fluid-like, enzyme-rich secretions. That's why if you've ever seen dogs, when they're eating, sometimes they'll kind of slobber, right? The reason why is simple, right? The enzyme-rich kind of saliva is a little